Scientists took the complete Neanderthal genome and compared it, gene by gene, to the DNA of living people across every single European nation. Germany, France, Romania, Greece, Finland, Spain, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Balkans, Scandinavia, the British Isles, every corner of the continent. They mapped ancient ancestry at a resolution nobody had ever attempted before, and when the results came back, a pattern emerged that no one had fully predicted. Neanderthal DNA is not spread evenly across Europe. It forms a gradient, a slow measurable shift that traces migration routes tens of thousands of years old, contact events that happened in caves and river valleys long before any of those countries existed. But one place stood completely apart from everything else, not because it had the most Neanderthal ancestry, because it had the least by a margin that made researchers look twice and then look again. And what they found when they looked closely at that place did not just answer a question about ancient human relatives. It rewrote the entire story of how modern Europe was built from the ground up. That is what we are walking through today. Before we get to the map, you need to understand who the Neanderthals actually were, because popular culture got them spectacularly wrong for over 100 years. The first recognized Neanderthal remains were found in 1856 in a limestone valley near Dusseldorf in Germany called the Neander Valley. The bones caused immediate controversy. Some scientists insisted they belonged to a diseased modern human with deformed bones. Others recognized immediately that something fundamentally different was staring back at them from the stone. It took decades of additional discoveries across Europe and Western Asia before the scientific consensus finally settled. Neanderthals were a distinct species of human, our closest evolutionary relatives, and they had been here on this planet for a very, very long time before we arrived. They appeared in the fossil record roughly 400,000 years ago. At their territorial peak, Neanderthal range stretched from Portugal in the west to the Altai Mountains of Siberia in the east, from the cold flatlands of northern Europe all the way down into the cave systems of the Middle East. And they were not the slow, dull brutes that a century of films and cartoons made them out to be. The archaeological record tells a completely different story. Neanderthals buried their dead. Some sites contain evidence suggesting flowers were placed in graves. They made sophisticated tools. They controlled fire. They created pigments. In at least some documented cases, they produced what researchers believe are genuine early forms of art and personal ornamentation. Their average brain size was roughly the same as ours. They also survived conditions that would have destroyed most populations. Multiple ice ages swept through Europe during the Neanderthal era. The glaciers advanced and retreated across hundreds of thousands of years. Entire ecosystems collapsed and rebuilt themselves repeatedly. Through all of it, Neanderthals adapted. Their bodies were shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of cold climate selection. Stocky builds to retain body heat, wide nasal passages to warm cold air before it reached the lungs, barrel-shaped chests, heavy brow ridges. Every feature was a solution to a specific environmental problem. They were extraordinarily well built for exactly the world they lived in. Then, roughly 40,000 years ago, they were gone. Modern humans had been arriving in Europe from Africa. Within a few thousand years of that contact, the Neanderthals disappeared. What exactly killed them is still debated by researchers. Competition for resources, disease brought by the newcomers, climate shifts that disrupted prey populations, gradual assimilation through interbreeding. Most likely, some combination of all of these. But one thing the DNA evidence has made completely and permanently undeniable is that before they vanished, they left something behind inside us. For most of the 20th century, the idea of extracting readable DNA from a creature that had been dead for 40,000 years was considered flatly impossible. Ancient DNA degrades. It breaks into short fragments. It gets contaminated by bacteria, fungi, and the hands and breath of every researcher who ever touched the specimen. The older the sample, the worse the damage. Scientists had essentially given up on the idea. The biological clock, they assumed, had simply run out. A Swedish geneticist named Svante Pääbo disagreed. He spent years developing methods to extract and read DNA from ancient remains, working around contamination problems, around chemically modified bases, around fragments so short and broken that conventional sequencing technology could not assemble them into anything meaningful. His early work in the 1980s involved cloning DNA from a 2,400-year-old Egyptian mummy. By the 1990s, his ambition had grown dramatically. He set his sights on the Neanderthal genome itself. The first material he worked with came from the original Neanderthal-type specimen, the very bones found in Feldhofer Cave in the Neander Valley in 1856, obtained from a museum in Bonn for collaborative research. What followed was decades of refinement, new sequencing technologies, new contamination controls, new computational methods capable of taking thousands of tiny damaged fragments and assembling them into something a scientist could actually read. In 2010, Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig published the first draft of the complete Neanderthal genome. sequenced from bone fragments more than 40,000 years old. The Nobel Committee later described this achievement as seemingly impossible. In 2022, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to Svante Pääbo for his discoveries concerning the genomes of extinct hominins and human evolution. The prize citation specifically highlighted paleogenomics, the entirely new scientific discipline his work had created. That draft genome changed everything. For the first time, scientists had a reference point. They could take the DNA of any living person and ask a precise, answerable question. How much of this came from a Neanderthal? The map of Europe was about to look completely different, but first there was a paradox that needed solving. When researchers used that Neanderthal genome as a reference and compared it to modern human DNA from populations all around the world, they found that all non-African populations carried Neanderthal ancestry, not just Europeans. People in East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Americas. All of them carried traces of the same interbreeding event. That global pattern pointed to something that happened before modern humans, split into those separate populations. It pointed to the Middle East. Archaeological evidence supported this. Neanderthal skeletons have been found in caves in Israel and across the Levant. A 55,000-year-old partial skull of a modern human discovered at Manat Cave in Israel put our ancestors in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. 2 landmark studies published in 2024 and 2025 used ancient genome data to pin the timing down more precisely. They independently reached the same conclusion. The interbreeding event that gave all living non-African people their Neanderthal ancestry happened around 47,000 years ago and lasted approximately 7,000 years. Not a single chance encounter. A sustained, prolonged period of contact between 2 kinds of human beings. Researchers also analyzed a 45,000-year-old femur from a man found in western Siberia. At that point, the earliest directly dated modern human outside Africa and the Middle East to have his genome sequenced. He already carried between 1.5 and 2.1% Neanderthal DNA. The interbreeding had already happened before he was born. The genetic handshake between 2 human species had already been made, sealed, and was already being carried across the ancient world. Once scientists had the complete Neanderthal genome as a reference, they could finally measure something that had only been estimated before. How much Neanderthal DNA does a living person actually carry? The answer turned out to be small but consistent and deeply unequal, depending on where in the world you looked. For people of non-African descent, the figure settled between 1.8 and 2.6% of the total genome. That range has been confirmed and refined across multiple studies using increasingly large datasets. Sub-Saharan African populations, whose ancestors never passed through the Middle Eastern contact zone where the interbreeding occurred, carry essentially none. The core pattern held clearly. Leave Africa, gain Neanderthal DNA. Stay in Africa, carry almost none. But then came the paradox. East Asian populations, people from China, Japan, Korea, and neighboring regions, consistently carried between 8 and 24% more Neanderthal DNA than Europeans. Not 8 to 24% total. 8 to 24% more than Europeans, who were already carrying their own proportion. That gap is substantial, and on its face, it made absolutely no sense at all. Neanderthals had lived across Europe and the Middle East for hundreds of thousands of years. Their fossils have been found in Spain, France, Germany, Belgium, Croatia, across the Levant. Not a single confirmed Neanderthal fossil has ever been recovered east of the Altai Mountains in Central Asia. Neanderthals, as far as the entire archaeological record shows, never reached East Asia. So why were East Asians carrying more of their DNA than the people living in the very lands where Neanderthals had actually roamed and built their lives for hundreds of thousands of years? The area where no Neanderthal remains have ever been found somehow contained more Neanderthal DNA than the area where they actually lived. That asymmetry demanded an explanation. The answer did not come from Neanderthal bones. It came from the bones of the people who came after them. Researchers at the University of Geneva, working with a massive database assembled by geneticist David Reich of Harvard Medical School containing sequenced genomes of more than 4,000 ancient humans who had lived across Europe and Asia at different points over the past 40,000 years, were finally able to watch Neanderthal ancestry shift across time, rather than just across geography. And what they saw turned the picture completely upside down. When scientists examined the oldest samples, Stone Age hunter-gatherers who had lived in Europe in the millennia immediately after Neanderthals went extinct, those ancient Europeans actually carried a slightly higher proportion of Neanderthal DNA than their Asian counterparts from the same time period. The pattern was the exact opposite of what exists today. Early Europeans had more, early Asians had less. Somewhere between then and now, something had flipped the entire ratio, and the culprit was farming. Around 10,000 years ago, a wave of agricultural peoples began moving out of Anatolia, the region that is now modern Turkey, spreading westward into Europe. These early farmers were themselves descendants of populations from the ancient Middle East, and crucially, they carried relatively little Neanderthal ancestry compared to the hunter-gatherers who were already living across Europe. As these farmers moved in and mixed with local populations, they diluted the Neanderthal signal across the entire European gene pool. The more farming ancestry a modern European population carries, the lower their Neanderthal percentage tends to be. The research published in Science Advances confirmed this mechanism clearly. European hunter-gatherers had a higher proportion of Neanderthal genes than the Neolithic farmers who came to settle Europe about 10,000 years ago, suggesting that this wave of newcomers diluted Neanderthal ancestry in Europe. East Asia did not experience the same wave. Asian agricultural populations developed their farming traditions independently. Their Neolithic transition was homegrown, driven by local populations who already carried their existing levels of Neanderthal DNA. No outside wave of low Neanderthal farmers arrived to dilute the signal. The Neanderthal ancestry that East Asian hunter-gatherers had accumulated over tens of thousands of years simply stayed in place, passed down generation after generation without interruption. East Asia did not see a similar influx as their farmers were homegrown, so East Asian genetics were not diluted in the same way. Europe, the continent where Neanderthals had lived for hundreds of thousands of years, ended up carrying less of their genetic legacy than regions they had never even reached. Now zoom back in on Europe itself, because even within the continent, the Neanderthal signal is not uniform. Once researchers began mapping ancestry at the regional level, rather than treating Europe as a single block, a gradient emerged. A slow, measurable shift that tracked the paths ancient populations had taken across the landscape tens of thousands of years earlier. The pattern runs roughly from southeast to northwest. Populations in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and neighboring regions tend to carry slightly higher levels of Neanderthal ancestry than populations in Northern and Western Europe. Scandinavia and the British Isles sit toward the lower end of the European range. The Iberian Peninsula shows moderately elevated levels compared to Northern Europe. The explanation follows the same logic that resolved the East Asia paradox, just applied at a finer scale. The Balkans were one of the primary entry points for modern humans as they moved into Europe from the Middle East, roughly 45,000 years ago. Those first arrivals encountered Neanderthal populations that had been established in the region for an enormous span of time. The contact was prolonged. The interbreeding that occurred left a measurable mark that has never been fully erased by the migrations that came after. Northern and Western Europe, by contrast, was populated later, often by smaller pioneer groups moving into regions where the Neanderthal overlap was briefer. Less contact time meant less interbreeding opportunity. And then the Neolithic farming wave hit Western and Northern Europe particularly hard, bringing large numbers of Anatolian-descended farmers into regions where the original hunter-gatherer populations were relatively sparse to begin with, diluting the archaic signal further. The genetic map of Neanderthal ancestry across Europe is not a map of racial categories. It is a map of footsteps. The preserved echo of every migration, every contact, every settlement, decision made by people who had no idea they were leaving a record that would still be perfectly readable 50,000 years later. But then, researchers found one population that sat so far outside the normal European range that geneticists returned to it again and again, each time finding the same extraordinary result. A population that measured lower on Neanderthal ancestry than any other European group that has ever been systematically studied. And understanding why tells you something profound about how genetics, geography, and time interact to preserve ancient signals that everywhere else have been permanently overwritten. That population lives on an island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. That island is Sardinia. Genomic data shows that Sardinia's population retained genetic similarities with ancient mainland Europeans more so than other modern European populations, emphasizing the relative isolation of Sardinia from the large-scale population turnovers that reshaped Europe during the Bronze Age. Multiple independent studies from the Max Planck Institute, from Harvard, from Italian research institutions, from teams publishing in Nature Communications and Science Advances, have all reached the same conclusion. Modern Sardinians carry less Neanderthal ancestry than any other European population that has been systematically studied, and the reason why reveals something extraordinary about this island and what it accidentally preserved. The story begins around 7000 BCE, when early Neolithic farmers from the ancient Middle East and Anatolia began arriving on the island. These were the same farming populations that were spreading across mainland Europe during the agricultural transition, the same low Neanderthal ancestry groups whose arrival was diluting the archaic signal across the continent. In most of Europe, those early farmers eventually mixed with waves of later migrants. Around 3000 BCE, Bronze Age pastoralists from the Eurasian steppe swept across the mainland, introducing a third major ancestry component into the European gene pool. Those steppe migrants, associated with what archaeologists call the Yamnaya culture, reached Scandinavia, the British Isles, Central Europe, and the Iberian Peninsula. They brought their own distinctive genetic signature with them, including their own levels of archaic ancestry, and they transformed the genetic profile of almost every population they encountered. They did not meaningfully reach Sardinia. The island's geography protected it. After the initial Neolithic settlement, Sardinia remained effectively disconnected from the Italian mainland. The Bronze Age transformation that reshaped continental European genetics passed the island by almost entirely. This enduring genetic continuity suggests that Sardinia's isolation played a role in preserving its ancestral genetic pool, even as its culture evolved, evidenced by the construction of the island's famous Nuraghe stone towers. What that meant in genomic terms was profound. Sardinians retained the ancestry profile of early European Neolithic farmers with a fidelity found nowhere else on the continent. Those early farmers had arrived in Europe already carrying relatively little Neanderthal DNA to begin with, because they came from Middle Eastern populations that had experienced the Neanderthal contact event, but had not been living alongside Neanderthals for hundreds of thousands of years, the way European hunter-gatherers had. Sardinia preserved that low baseline, undiluted and uninterrupted, across millennia of isolation. While the rest of Europe was being layered with new migrations, new genetic contributions, new ancestry components from populations moving in every direction, Sardinia stayed still. It became, without anyone intending it, the purest surviving genetic record of what early European farmers actually looked like at the genomic level. One of the most fascinating revelations from ancient DNA research on the island is the connection between Sardinians and Ötzi the Iceman, a 5,000 feet 100-year-old mummy discovered in the Alps. Genomic data shows that Ötzi's DNA is most similar to modern Sardinians, suggesting that the island's population retained genetic similarities with ancient mainland Europeans, more so than other modern European populations. That alignment confirmed what the ancient DNA data had been suggesting for years. Sardinians are not an outlier because something is missing from their genetics. They are an outlier because something was preserved. What stands out about Sardinia is not a deficiency. It is a photograph. A clear, undisturbed genetic photograph of what the first farmers of Europe actually looked like, taken 7,000 years ago, and never overexposed by the migrations that kept reshaping everyone else. Now here's where this entire story connects to something that is happening right now in your body, regardless of where in the world you were born or what your ancestry is, because knowing that Neanderthal DNA exists inside modern human genomes is one thing. Understanding what it actually does is completely another. And the answer to that question is one of the most remarkable findings in modern biology. For years after the initial discovery of interbreeding, researchers assumed that the inherited Neanderthal segments were mostly neutral, genetic passengers just along for the ride, neither helping nor hurting the people who carried them. The more scientists looked at the actual distribution and function of those segments, the more that assumption completely collapsed. The Neanderthal genes that survived in modern human genomes did not survive by accident. Natural selection is ruthless about removing DNA that causes harm and equally ruthless about preserving DNA that confers advantage. And the segments of Neanderthal ancestry still present in living people today are disproportionately concentrated in two systems, the immune system and the skin. That concentration is the fingerprint of what mattered most when modern humans first walked into environments they had never encountered before. Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to the cold, dark, pathogen-rich environments of Europe and Western Asia. They had built immune defenses against diseases that modern humans from Africa had never faced. When our ancestors arrived and began interbreeding, they picked up specific toll-like receptor genes, TLR1, TLR6, and TLR10, that dramatically improved their ability to detect and respond to the bacteria, fungi, and parasites that were endemic to those new northern environments. Research confirmed that these Neanderthal-derived immune variants are still present in modern Eurasian populations and still functionally active today, influencing inflammatory responses in ways that can protect against infection. Neanderthal DNA also shapes visible traits in living people right now. A landmark study using data from 112,000 individuals in the UK Biobank found that Neanderthal DNA influences skin tone, hair color, sleeping patterns, and mood in present-day Europeans. One particular region associated with skin and hair pigmentation is carried by more than half of all present-day Europeans in its Neanderthal form. That extraordinary prevalence is strong evidence that this variant was actively favored by natural selection after it entered the human gene pool. It helped people survive. So it spread. And then came the finding that made international headlines in 2020. Hugo Zeeberg and Svante Pabo published a study in Nature identifying the major genetic risk factor for severe COVID-19, the gene cluster on chromosome 3 linked to respiratory failure and hospitalization, as a segment of DNA inherited directly from Neanderthals. That stretch of ancient DNA is carried by approximately 16% of people in Europe and around 50% of people in South Asia. The same genes that may have helped ancient humans fight off prehistoric pathogens in the caves of Europe turned out, 50,000 years later, to carry elevated risk against a respiratory virus that our ancestors could never have imagined. The Neanderthal inheritance cuts in multiple directions simultaneously, beneficial in one environment, potentially harmful in another, because evolution optimizes for the past, and the past does not always match the present. But here is perhaps the most revealing finding of all. Certain regions of the modern human genome are conspicuously empty of Neanderthal DNA. Not by random chance, by active purging over tens of thousands of years. The regions most depleted of Neanderthal ancestry tend to cluster around genes involved in male fertility, brain development, and neurological function. Researchers interpreted this pattern as evidence that some Neanderthal genetic variants were simply incompatible with fully modern human biology. And when two populations that have been separated for hundreds of thousands of years come back together and interbreed, their genomes do not always integrate smoothly. Genetic incompatibilities accumulate during long periods of separation. The children of such crossings can be viable and healthy, but certain gene combinations from each parent conflict at the molecular level, reducing survival or reproductive success. Natural selection then removes those combinations over generations. What remains is the subset of archaic DNA that caused no conflict, or better still, provided a genuine advantage. A 2024 study tracking Neanderthal DNA segments across time confirmed that most of the archaic ancestry present in living people today traces back to the same original interbreeding event around 47,000 years ago. But the portions that survive to the present represent only a filtered, tested, selected fraction of what was originally inherited. The Neanderthal DNA inside modern humans today is not a random sample of what Neanderthals carried. It is a curated collection. The segments that passed a 50,000-year biological audition. Every stretch of Neanderthal ancestry still present in a living person exists because at some point in the chain of generations between then and now, it earned its place. And in June 2026, a new study published in Nature generated genetic data from 27 Neanderthals who lived in Belgium and France less than approximately 52,500 years ago, producing the most detailed portrait yet of late Neanderthal population structure. The findings revealed close genetic connections between individuals from geographically distant regions, indicating a level of long-range connectivity among late Neanderthals that researchers had not fully appreciated before. The picture of who these people were and how they organized their lives keeps getting more complex, more human, and more surprising with every new piece of data. When millions of people today send DNA samples to ancestry testing companies, they participate in something that would have been unimaginable to the scientists who first dug Neanderthal bones out of the Neander Valley in 1856. The results they receive, the small percentage on their ancestry report labeled as Neanderthal, is an estimate shaped by which Neanderthal genomes are available for comparison and which statistical methods the company uses to identify archaic segments. Different companies return different numbers for the same person. The figure is useful as a rough indicator, but should not be read as a fixed biological constant. What the number does capture, imperfectly but genuinely, is the cumulative effect of every migration, every contact event, and every selection pressure that shaped the ancestral lineage of that specific person from the moment modern humans first encountered Neanderthals in the ancient Middle East. A person of Scandinavian descent carrying 2.3% Neanderthal ancestry is carrying a signal shaped by the original interbreeding event, filtered by tens of thousands of years of selection, diluted by the Neolithic farming wave out of Anatolia, and partially restored by Bronze Age steppe migrations, all compressed into a single percentage on a report. A Sardinian carrying a lower percentage than that Scandinavian is not carrying less ancient history. They are carrying different ancient history, the preserved signal of early Neolithic farmers who arrived in Europe before the later migrations that reshaped everyone else. Their lower number is a record of isolation. It marks the boundary between the Europe that existed before the Bronze Age transformed it and the Europe that exists today. This is what the comparison of Neanderthal DNA across European nations ultimately reveals. The map is not a ranking. It is a timeline collapsed into geography. Every data point on it represents real people who made real journeys across ice and water and mountain ranges and river valleys and left traces in the genomes of people alive right now who have no idea those journeys ever happened. Every population is a palimpsest, a document written over and over by generations of people who moved, mixed, survived, and adapted, each wave leaving a mark that the next wave partially covered but never completely erased. The Neanderthal story is the oldest layer of that document for everyone living outside of Africa today. It is the record of a meeting between two kinds of human beings in caves and valleys in the ancient Middle East, roughly 47,000 years ago. That meeting lasted approximately 7,000 years. What it produced is still inside you now, still shaping your immune response, still influencing your skin, still present in a small but measurable fraction of every cell in your body. The Neanderthals are gone from the earth, but they are not entirely absent from it. They left the best record they could. They left it inside us.